Hello, in this video, I want to start off and continue with the series that we've been talking about, introducing a new LD topic. The first video that I did was just talking about intellectual property in general, because I think that when I saw the resolution, it was the first thing that really drew to my head. And so in this video and in the next video, I want to break down what I think are some of the other key portions of the resolution. If you have not heard what the LD resolution is for September and October of 2021, it is resolved: the member nations of the World Trade Organization ought to reduce intellectual property protections for medicines. And so I think that I kind of want to break this video down to talking a little bit about intellectual property, which I did in the first video. And in this video, I want to talk about the World Trade Organization, which is the mechanism or the actor for the resolution. And then I want to talk a little bit specifically more about like IP protection in the context of medicine and what intellectual property may mean in the context of medicine. Specifically, all of this in the context of critical ground. I think that a lot of the places that I want to kind of talk about is thinking through the way in which the history of kind of certain organizations and ideas such as like the WTO or the World Trade Organization and IPP or intellectual protections in its relationship to medicine as these kind of like thematic things that really have opened up a lot of ground for critical teams. And I think that for a lot of people that have been debating for a while, intellectual property is a resolution or a resolution area that I think people have been playing around with for a couple years in terms of an idea, but it's something that is definitely catching more ground now, and it's something that people are definitely a little bit more excited to debate about. And so I think that being able to talk about how it relates to the specific use of like the World Trade Organization and the way that the mechanism kind of changed on this resolution is a really good question to ask, and kind of where I want to start this particular video, when just asking like, what is the World Trade Organization if you've never heard of it, or if you've only debated on resolutions where you debated about the United States federal government or just not the World Trade Organization. The World Trade Organization is an international organization of over 142 governments. Basically, the idea is that the World Trade Organization is supposed to be basically help regulate commerce and trade between governments internationally, and it's basically there to be an enforcement for things like global trade rules, which was kind of like more valuable than the previous laws that were had. Basically, I think before the World Trade Organization was created, there were kind of a series of laws that were being used to establish international trade norms that weren't really basically held as strictly as they could, and there wasn't really a strong force of implementation behind them to hold countries accountable for how they were engaging internationally. And so the World Trade Organization became a way to basically assign and create the basis for what was thought of as like equitable trade based off of laws and norms that were kind of being established by the 142 governments that are part of the organization. The problem with the World Trade Organization that people have found in various studies and critiques of the World Trade Organization is that international corporations and various international values have increasing control over the WTO. So I think that the problem that a lot of institutions are having, especially governments, is that corporations have been able to, international corporations have obviously been able to expand themselves to be able to really be coercive or powerful in various different types of government. And so I think that a lot of the stuff that's happening in the WTO is kind of encouraged and backed by various international corporations that already have large standing. And so a lot of the arguments that are kind of being geared towards the WTO are how it's kind of cementing already existing basically relationships between like the rich and the global poor, and how it kind of like establishes Western notions or centers kind of like Western kind of like values of who has control and how they kind of gain control. I think that the WTO is interesting for a couple reasons. I think that obviously there is a critique of the World Trade Organization that is really good in the context of capitalism, because there is such a historical tie between the ways in which various international corporations have backed governments, have backed politicians, etc., and the way that that has influenced decisions in the World Trade Organization without a lot of like strict restrictions that stop them from being able to have that kind of like intervention or coercive potential. But I also think that there are a lot of arguments being made about just how the WTO is kind of a perfect example of how the scope of the international works in relationship to like assigning something that is kind of universal or something that kind of like is meant to be equitable for all nations. I think that it's really interesting, because I think that when people go to the World Trade Organization, the first place that people kind of go to is to a critique of capitalism, because of the way in which it's just heavily kind of related to the maintenance of capital at a really global scale. But I think there are a lot of really interesting, good critiques of the international that can come from all types of literature bases. I think there are a lot of ones about how the WTO are ways to implement and basically extend and confer forms of colonialism, and ways of thinking about intellectual property as a form of colonialism, vis-a-vis the way in which we think about how knowledge is circulated, thought of, and basically centered around and connected to these international organizations. Because the organizations and various organizations that do have stakes in the WTO or do that have really big stakes in international trade have an extremely large investment also in the ability to kind of like maintain a certain kind of direction and the way in which travel and etc. flows, because they want to have power in the places in which like they're able to gain the most influence. And so there is always basically this kind of like basically back and forth that's happening between some of the larger, more powerful nations. Think of like the US, Russia, China, etc. But also think about the way in which this kind of relates to how smaller nations can have and struggle to find their footing in a world where basically the way in which their stuff is kind of like already dictated is through the kind of the ability to already be influenced by these larger corporations that could have like stakes in various developments in their country that kind of provide the basis for them to be able to exist in the WTO as they do. And it creates all these interesting coercive connections between how nations with kind of like larger play and a larger set of corporations to work with kind of create these various pacts and interesting relationships with smaller nations in order to produce and basically create an importation of Western values that impose all different ways of coming to understand and know the world, and basically creates a kind of entry to the world stage that requires the ability to like basically adapt to how Western capitalism has created and kind of consumed the world stage. I think that outside of capitalism, I think there are a lot of ways in which paradigms, like for instance, that critique a lot of the stuff that we were talking about in the last video, where we think about like how knowledge is kind of centered around the idea of like, for instance, especially around medicine, these kind of distinct scientists that are disconnected from the people. How is that kind of cemented by the way in which international organizations are able to basically cement themselves in the WTO as the organizations that you go to for vaccines, for various types of medicines and other types of necessities that are kind of controlled through the kind of laws that are created through international intellectual property protections. And how is that kind of system cemented by not just capitalism, but the way in which an entire organizing system attempts to dictate and create a flow of not only like commerce and like economy, but knowledge as a commodity. I think is really the type of question that you want to be raising about the WTO, is how do you take your critiques that you can already make about how the international is kind of already created by and invested in by various types of like Western values that already dictate how we think of, perceive, relate to various types of nations, the way in which we use trade and other types of like law affairs and international trade laws against various types of smaller nations, even thinking like things that have happened during the Cold War, etc., and countries that have suffered as a result. And how does that translate to the idea of turning intellect, knowledge, and something like medicine to something as a commodity that can be dispersed through the international order? And how does that affect people domestically, and how does that affect the kind of like disconnects and inequalities between how people get access to these things internationally? I think it's the type of question that you really want to ask on this resolution. Hopefully you found this video helpful, and hopefully you'll tune into more of the videos that I'll be doing, kind of talking about my thoughts on the LD resolution and the way that I think it'll end up being hammered out and the types of questions that you should ask yourself. And yeah, hopefully this will become more clear as we do the kind of maybe more final video on just a basic breakdown for the resolution. Thanks.